Your soulmate just learned you're about to leave. And they panicked. My beloved child. Your soulmate just found out something they were never prepared to hear: you're about to leave. And the moment that truth reached them, something inside them changed. They had been trying to act calm. They had been pretending they could handle the distance, the silence, the uncertainty. But when they realized you weren't simply taking space anymore, you were actually preparing to walk away, they panicked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It happened in the quiet moments, when they were alone with their thoughts and suddenly understood what losing you would really mean. One question kept coming back to them: what if this time, they really don't come back? And that question frightened them more than they expected. Because there was something they never told you, something they believed they still had plenty of time to say. At first, they tried to convince themselves that you were only tired. That you would eventually soften. That the connection between you was strong enough to survive another delay, another misunderstanding, another moment of silence. But then they noticed the difference in you. You weren't chasing answers anymore. You weren't waiting for them to make the first move. You had reached a point where your heart was saying, I can love someone deeply and still choose myself. And somehow, they felt that shift from a distance. That's when their fear became real. They started replaying old conversations, remembering moments when you needed reassurance and they gave you silence. They remembered every time they almost confessed what they felt, and stopped themselves. Don't skip, because what happened next revealed just how deeply your absence was already affecting them. Then came the moment they couldn't ignore. They saw something, or heard something, that made them realize your plans were no longer just an emotional thought. You were actually preparing for a new chapter. And suddenly, the possibility of losing you became a deadline. They wanted to reach out, but fear held their hand back. What if you rejected them? What if you had already made your decision? What if they waited one more day and that day became the moment they lost their chance forever? So they began considering something they had avoided for far too long, telling you the truth without hiding behind pride, distance, or excuses. But there's one reason they're still hesitating, and when you understand what they're afraid to admit, you'll finally understand why their panic began the moment they realized you were serious about leaving. They didn't sleep much that night. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the same possibility: your life moving forward without them in it. And what scared them most wasn't simply losing your presence. It was realizing they might lose the chance to tell you everything they had kept buried. They picked up their phone more than once, opened your conversation, typed something, then erased it. We need to talk felt too cold. I miss you felt too small. And please don't leave felt like admitting a fear they had spent months pretending didn't exist. So they stared at your name in silence, wondering whether you could somehow feel the battle happening inside them. Then, just when they were ready to put the phone down, they remembered one specific moment between you, something you said that suddenly made sense in a completely different way. That memory changed everything. They remembered the way you once asked them, almost casually, if I stopped waiting for you, would you even notice? At the time, they didn't understand how serious that question was. Maybe they laughed it off. Maybe they changed the subject. Maybe they assumed you'd always be there because your feelings had always been so obvious. But now those words were echoing through their mind, and they finally understood what you had been trying to tell them. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for certainty. You wanted to know whether they were brave enough to choose you when choosing you actually required something from them. And suddenly, their panic wasn't about controlling your decision. It was about confronting their own regret. They realized they had been waiting for the perfect moment, while you had been slowly running out of reasons to wait. Then something unexpected happened. They started writing the message they had been too afraid to send. This time, they didn't try to sound confident. They didn't pretend everything was fine. They didn't hide behind vague words. They began with the one sentence they had resisted saying for so long. I know you're leaving, and I finally understand why. But they stopped before sending it. Their finger hovered over the screen because they knew that once those words reached you, there would be no hiding anymore. You would see the fear. You would see the regret. And you might finally see the truth behind all those confusing actions. But before they could press send, they received something that made their heart drop, because the message wasn't from you. It was from someone who knew exactly what was happening between the two of you. That thought was the one thing they couldn't escape. They had spent so long believing that if they ever opened their heart, you would still be standing there waiting. But now they weren't sure. And for the first time, they understood something they had never wanted to admit: love doesn't always disappear because feelings change. Sometimes it disappears because one person gets tired of carrying the uncertainty alone. They looked at the unfinished message again, then added one more sentence. I'm not asking you to stay because I'm scared. I'm asking for one honest conversation before you go. Their thumb hovered over the screen. This wasn't the confident version of themselves they usually showed you. This was vulnerable. Exposed. Real. Then they finally pressed send. The message left their phone, and suddenly there was nothing else they could control. For several minutes, they stared at the screen, waiting for the smallest sign that you had seen it. Nothing. No reply. No reaction. Just silence. And that silence felt louder than anything you had ever said. They began imagining every possibility. Maybe you were sleeping. Maybe you were busy. Maybe you saw the message and decided not to answer. That last possibility hurt the most. Because if you had chosen silence after everything they had finally confessed, they would have to accept that their realization had come too late. Then, unexpectedly, your name appeared on their screen. Their heart jumped. But the message you sent wasn't what they expected. You didn't say you were staying. You didn't say you were leaving. You simply asked, "Why now?" 4 words. Yet those 4 words forced them to confront the truth they had been avoiding from the beginning. They stared at your question for what felt like forever. Why now? Because you deserved an answer. Not another emotional speech. Not another promise made in fear. A real answer. They began typing, stopped, deleted everything, and started again. Finally, they wrote, "Because I thought I had more time with you." Then another message followed. "I kept thinking you'd wait until I was ready. I didn't realize you were getting ready to live without me." That was the moment their panic became clarity. They weren't afraid because you were leaving tomorrow. They were afraid because you had finally reached a place where you could leave without looking back. And now they had one final chance to prove that their feelings weren't just words spoken because they were afraid of losing you. They knew the next few words could change everything. So instead of sending another emotional confession, they asked you for the one thing they had avoided for so long, a real conversation. No excuses. No disappearing. No pretending that the timing was wrong. They wanted to sit across from you and finally answer every question they had once avoided. But there was something else happening inside them. They were beginning to realize that your decision to leave had forced them to see themselves honestly. They could no longer blame circumstances, distance, confusion, or bad timing. They had choices. And one of those choices had been silence. I should have told you sooner, they finally admitted. Not because I suddenly developed feelings, but because I was afraid of what those feelings would require from me. That confession made the situation even more complicated, because now you understood something important: their distance had never meant you were unimportant. When you read those words, something inside you became quiet. Not because every doubt disappeared, but because you finally had a piece of the truth you had been waiting for. They continued, telling you that they had watched you become stronger while they remained stuck in the same emotional place. They noticed how you stopped asking for reassurance. How your messages became shorter. How you stopped trying to force conversations that weren't happening naturally. And secretly, every one of those changes frightened them. They had mistaken your patience for endless patience. Now they were realizing that your silence wasn't punishment. It was acceptance. You were preparing yourself for a life where you didn't have to wonder every morning whether someone was going to choose you. And that realization hit them harder than any goodbye could have. They finally understood that if they wanted a place in your future, they couldn't simply ask for it, they had to become honest enough to deserve it. Then came the sentence that changed the entire conversation. After everything they had written, they finally said, "I don't want to stop you from leaving if leaving is what you truly need. But I need you to know that losing you would hurt me far more than I ever let you see." You read it again. There was no pressure hidden inside those words. No demand. Just vulnerability. And somehow, that made them more powerful. Because for the first time, they weren't trying to control the outcome. They were giving you the truth and allowing you to decide what to do with it. But just when you thought the conversation had reached its deepest point, they revealed one final thing, something they had discovered only after learning you were preparing to leave. And that secret was the reason they had been fighting their feelings all along. The truth about your plans hit them harder than anything you had said before. You weren't simply taking a little distance. You were preparing to make a serious change in your life, one that could put real space between you and them. Suddenly, all those quiet signs made sense: the way you had been organizing your priorities, protecting your peace, and becoming less dependent on their attention. They realized you had already started building a future that didn't require them to participate. And that frightened them because they could no longer assume they would somehow be included later. When they finally understood this, their entire attitude changed. They stopped thinking about how to convince you to stay and started thinking about what they needed to say before the opportunity disappeared. There was no more time for half-truths. No more waiting for the perfect moment. The moment was already here. When you finally agreed to meet, they arrived earlier than they needed to. They sat quietly, rehearsing sentences in their head, but every sentence sounded wrong. They didn't want to give you another emotional speech that would fade the moment the conversation ended. They wanted you to see something different in them. When you arrived, they looked at you for a few seconds without speaking. And strangely, that silence said more than all their previous messages. They could see the change in you immediately. You weren't angry. You weren't trying to punish them. You simply looked, decided. That was when they understood the seriousness of the moment. They took a breath and said, "I know I don't have the right to ask you to stay." Then they paused. "But before you go, I need you to hear the truth from me, not the version I gave you before, but the truth I was too afraid to admit." And what they said next wasn't what you expected. They admitted that they had been afraid of becoming emotionally dependent on someone they couldn't control losing. They admitted that every time the connection became deeper, they created distance because vulnerability felt dangerous to them. But then they looked directly at you and said something that changed the entire meaning of their panic. "I wasn't scared because you were leaving. I was scared because I finally realized I wanted a future where you didn't." Your heart went completely still. Because that sentence revealed the real battle happening inside them. They weren't asking you to erase everything that happened. They were asking for the chance to show you that the person who had once run from closeness might finally be ready to stop running. But then you asked them one question they had absolutely no prepared answer for. The question was simple, but it cut straight through everything they had been trying to explain. "If I had never decided to leave, would you have ever told me the truth?" They looked down because they knew there was no safe answer. For a few seconds, they said nothing. Then they finally admitted, "I don't know." And somehow, that honesty mattered more than a perfect answer would have. They told you they had become comfortable believing there would always be more time, more chances, more conversations. Your decision to leave had forced them to confront something painful. Sometimes people don't realize the value of a moment until they understand it may be their last. They weren't proud of needing that wake-up call. But they were grateful it happened before you disappeared completely. Then they reached into their pocket and pulled out something they had carried with them for longer than you realized. It was a small reminder of you. Something ordinary that most people would have overlooked, but something they had kept because it represented a moment when they felt completely understood. They placed it in front of you and explained why they never threw it away. They had carried it through every period of distance, every misunderstanding, and every night when they told themselves they were better off staying silent. "I kept this because part of me always knew," they said. "I just didn't know what to do with that feeling." You looked at them, and for the first time, their fear didn't look like weakness. It looked like someone finally confronting the consequences of their own choices. But they didn't ask you to promise anything. They simply told you that whatever happened next, they wanted to stop hiding behind uncertainty. And then you noticed something in their expression that made you realize they still hadn't told you everything. They took a breath and said, "There's one more thing you need to know before you decide." Your heart tightened. They explained that the moment they learned you were leaving, they had already made a decision of their own. They had cancelled something they had been planning for months, not because they were trying to trap you, but because they finally understood what mattered more. They were willing to change their plans, confront their fear, and step toward you without knowing whether you would choose them. "I can't promise you that everything will be perfect," they whispered. "But I can promise you won't have to wonder where I stand anymore." And for the first time, you realized their panic had never been about losing control of you. It was about finally losing the chance to become the person they should have been from the beginning. The question now wasn't whether they were afraid of you leaving, it was whether you were ready to believe what they were finally brave enough to say. For the first time, you didn't feel the urge to answer immediately. You simply looked at them and let the silence exist. Because after everything they had said, you understood that this moment wasn't really about their fear anymore. It was about your choice. They had finally stepped out from behind hesitation, but that didn't erase the moments when you felt alone. It didn't erase the unanswered questions or the nights when you wondered whether you mattered to them as much as they mattered to you. They seemed to understand that too. Instead of reaching for your hand, they stayed where they were and said, "Take whatever time you need." Those words surprised you because the old version of them would have tried to convince you immediately. But this time, they were willing to let your decision belong to you. And somehow, that restraint revealed more than any dramatic promise could have. You finally asked what had been sitting in your heart for so long, "What happens if I still leave?" Their expression changed, but they didn't look away. "Then I'll have to respect it," they said. "But I don't want fear to be the reason either of us walks away." That answer stayed with you. Because suddenly, the connection wasn't about chasing, begging, or proving who cared more. It was about two people standing at a crossroads with nothing left to hide. They admitted they had spent too much time waiting for certainty before taking a risk. You admitted that you had spent too much time hoping their silence meant something different. And in that moment, both of you recognized the same painful truth. The feelings may have been real all along, but feelings without action had created a distance neither of you intended. Then something unexpected happened. Your phone vibrated. You looked down and saw a message connected to the decision you had been preparing to make. It was confirmation that everything was moving forward. The deadline was real. The opportunity was real. And suddenly, the time you thought you had to figure everything out became much shorter. Your soulmate saw your expression and immediately knew something had changed. "Is it happening?" they asked. You nodded. Their face went still. They had been hoping for more time, but now they understood that the choice couldn't be postponed forever. They stood, took a slow breath, and said the one sentence you never expected to hear from them, "Then I'm not going to ask you to stop your life for me." But before you could respond, they revealed what they planned to do instead. And that decision was about to change everything. They looked at you with a calmness you hadn't seen before and said, "If you're leaving to become the person you're meant to be, I won't stand in your way. But I'm not disappearing either." You didn't know what to say. They explained that for once, they weren't going to make promises based on panic. They weren't going to ask you to cancel your plans, delay your future, or carry the responsibility for their emotions. Instead, they wanted to prove that their feelings could survive without controlling your choices. "Go," they said quietly. "Build the life you've been afraid to build. And if there's still a place for me when you're ready, I'll meet you there." Those words hit differently because you could hear the difference between desperation and genuine love. Their panic had brought them to the edge, but instead of pulling you backward, it finally pushed them toward maturity. Still, there was one thing they hadn't told you about the decision they had already made. They reached for their phone and showed you a message they had sent earlier that morning. It wasn't to a friend. It wasn't to someone trying to interfere. It was confirmation that they had taken a step they had been postponing for a long time, something personal they needed to resolve before they could honestly ask anyone to build.